The future of America? Contact report 544.
Then that is therefore also clear. Thank you. In recent weeks, I have been asked again and again about the events of the 11th of September 2001 in New York because of the terrorist attack. But there are also broadcasts on television about conspiracy theories concerning the events of the 11th of September 2001. In this connection, for example, the predominant conspiracy theory is that the U.S. government itself instigated this catastrophe and had the CIA, etc., pack the two towers full of explosives and then have them blown up, which is why they collapsed. If you permit, I would today for once like to turn the conversation to the USA, to its former presidents as well as to the worldwide machinations, and the way in which the U.S.-American politics and behavior are conducted. Of course, super smart ones, such as certain loudmouth journalists from certain newspapers, will then again scold along saying that you and I would politicize during our talks and would also do so publicly once the reports of the conversations are written down and published. Unfortunately, these fools and failures, who express themselves in this malevolent and negative way and call themselves journalists, are not intelligent enough to comprehend and understand that you and I only express our free opinion on factual situations, and that we do nothing more than set forth facts and show possibilities which can arise from a deplorable state of affairs.
Of course, I will involve myself in a conversation with you in the mentioned manner, because there is a lot to say, to explain and to show as possibilities which can result from the far-reaching diverse and wrong, as well as diverse forms of politics and behavior of the USA. However, if I want to explain something first in relation to the conspiracy theory, which is widespread in relation to the 11th of September 2001, and not only in the United States, it must be said that this is in fact corresponds to a nonsense. Truthfully, everything arose the way the investigations by specialists and the secret services have resulted. Nevertheless, however, there were certain weak intelligence findings in relation to this al-Qaeda crime, which were also brought to the attention of U.S. President George W. Bush, but which he completely ignored, just as they were not taken seriously to the extent that they should have been by the few people who were responsible for it at the CIA, namely only 3 persons who vaguely knew about the findings. The ignorance on the part of Bush himself was based on sheer foolishness, on the one hand, and on the other, on the deeply rooted and only halfway conscious of confused thoughts of having a means of countering the ever-present threat of terror on a global scale, should a terrorist catastrophe occur. As we were able to clarify, the vague cognitions of the 3 CIA people, 2 agents and a supervisor, were directed towards the likely possibility of a terrorist attack on the USA, whereby, however, not a single assumption referred to the 2 towers of the WTC. The assumption was simply of a general nature. In his confused foolishness, the U.S. President G.W. Bush was unable to calculate the real danger in advance to such an extent that he would have ordered measures that take hold and also mobilized the CIA on a large scale for the purpose of making accurate investigations and taking precautionary nationwide protection measures. And such protection measures would in fact have been possible, as our probability calculations have shown, but as a result of the failure of the U.S. President and the 3 CIA people, everything turned out differently. However, this was already in 1976, noticeable like that, when my daughter Sim Yase made the respective predictions for you, and you were obliged to silence. Then Quetzal made the same predictions for you again in 1986. You probably remember it.
That is the case, yes, because I became hellishly miserable when Sim Yase made the prediction for me that there would be around 3,000 dead. But I also felt the same way another time, when Quetzal mentioned the same event to me again in 1986 and explained what would really transpire. It is simply incomprehensible why the American people elect such zeros and fools into the government, who bring the country nothing but tremendous damage, just as it has happened again and again since ancient times. One only needs to think of the most important things and factors that brought an enormous amount of misery into the world, and that were triggered by U.S. presidents. Look here. With this facts of the 9th of August, I received this list from Germany regarding a few of the 43 U.S. presidents who stood out particularly crassly in terms of their criminal and felonious machinations. It also shows that Barack Obama is in reality only the 43rd and not the 44th U.S. president, because one of them, Grover Cleveland, was elected president on 2 different occasions, namely on the 4th of March 1885, and he held office until the 4th of March 1889. 4 years later, on the 4th of March 1893, he was once again elected and remained in office until the 4th of March 1897. So, this man was both the 22nd as well as the 23rd U.S. president, and thereby the only one who has held 2 terms which did not directly follow each other. Consequently, Grover Cleveland cannot be described as 2 different presidents. But such inconsistencies have arisen in the USA since its establishment, just as such still arise today. But back to the criminal and felonious machinations of various U.S. presidents, such as, for example, those charged to President William McKinley, who was the real originator of the military conflict started in 1898 with Spain, which lost the war activities. McKinley created the Guantanamo exclave in Cuba, where George W. Bush then had political prisoners imprisoned and tortured from 2002 onwards, a practice that is still carried out in this penal and torture camp to this day. Ronald Reagan, a former bad actor and dim intellect, was on the payroll of the FBI as informant T-10 who, as such, continually squealed on, as communists, more than 50 fellow actors to the FBI. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer, ordered the CIA to support the Islamic guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan, where a civil war was underway, in which the Soviet Union had also involved itself. Supplies of arms were also connected with this, which, after the victory over the communist government of Afghanistan in 1992, were then used by the militias, which now fought each other, whereby subsequently the brutal and violent as well as religiously fanatical group of the Taliban emerged from this, which from then on terrorized the people. And this could only have gone so far because Jimmy Carter intervened in the Afghanistan conflict and allowed the CIA to freely operate there at will. The whole thing then simmered on for years and finally led to another Islamist organization, Al-Qaeda, which then brought about the catastrophe in New York on the 11th of September 2001. The President John F. Kennedy was no better either, because in the year 1963, he secretly enacted a law that enabled him to print vast amounts of money, of which the Treasury Department spent $4.2 million. This money, that is to say the banknotes, did not belong to the USA, but to a group of private banks which, in 1913, had merged into the Federal Reserve System Fed. The U.S. state does not have the right to print banknotes itself, because only the Fed is entitled to do so, from which the government has to borrow the money, and on whose notes Federal Reserve Note is written, whereas on Kennedy's notes United States Note is written. On the other hand, Kennedy's banknote stated United States Note. Therefore, from the Fed's point of view, Kennedy's banknotes were counterfeit money, which Lyndon B. Johnson had taken out of circulation in his first official act as Kennedy's successor, when he was assassinated in 1963. Then there was the President George Washington, who actually started the First World War with the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, which means that 3 world wars have already taken place, and not just 2. Although your father Svath already told me that, but I had completely forgotten it, so I only stumbled upon it again through this chronicle here. Well, Washington, as a military leader in the War of Independence, as a liberal thinker, was also a shrewd leader of state when the Constitution was being drafted. At the age of 22, he was still a British officer in the American colonies. He was thereby then involved in an incident that was fundamentally the cause of the real First World War, which shook the earth. With 160 soldiers in 1754, he patrolled the Ohio Valley between British and French territories. In May of that year, the French sent a diplomat to get Washington out of their territory. However, the latter ordered the firing on the diplomatic corps, where through the French negotiator and about 13 of his soldiers who went with him were deliberately murdered, with Washington's hope of driving a wedge between the French and the British, because only such a conflict between the two colonial powers could lead to the success regarding the American War of Independence. This felony led to the triggering of the so-called French and Indian War, from which, 2 years later, emerged the bloody conflicts between the great European powers, and thus the 7 Years' War, which was fought in America, Europe, and Asia, and therefore was worldwide, which is why this was the real First World War, which is concealed from the world's population. That is why there was and is always talk of the threat of a Third World War. Consequently, if another world-encompassing war were to break out as a result of the greed for might of some irrational mightful ones of states, this would then be the Fourth World War. Over the course of the years, I had completely forgotten this, because I only remembered what Svath had told me about the First World War when I saw this chronology. President Andrew Jackson was just as criminal as Washington, and he must be held responsible for the first and so far greatest ethnic cleansing in the history of U.S. America. Criminally, he drove 100,000 Indians from their homeland, although even as a soldier he was already acting mercilessly and murderously against natives of the country, murdering many or expelling them. On the 28th of May 1830, he signed the so-called Indian Removal Act, being the death sentence for countless more Indians, because this law allowed the relocation of the Indian tribes to create areas for their settlement by white farmers, etc. In this way, about a quarter of all deported Indians died, on the one hand because they were murdered by the whites, or, on the other hand, because they did not survive the forced marches to the distant places of deportation or reservations and died miserably. President Franklin D. Roosevelt also made himself guilty, in that he wanted and provoked the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, this was only discovered 60 years later by a former naval officer named Robert Stinnett. In relation to that, one expert said, "It took such an act to make the American nation immediately and totally turn to war." With a trade embargo, Roosevelt forced the Japanese to adopt coercive measures, which came to the fore in a counterattack against the embargo, thus the attack on Pearl Harbor, in which there were 2,403 dead and 1,178 wounded to mourn, as well as the destruction of 14 warships and 320 destroyed or severely damaged aircrafts. 90% of all U.S. Americans were initially opposed to an entry into the Second World War I. Third World War, however, after Pearl Harbor, the people also screamed for war. By the way, Roosevelt learned of the threat of attack through the Secret Services, but he did not react to prevent anything, just as George W. Bush did not react when it came to prevent the terror catastrophe of the 11th of September 2001. Furthermore, there was President John Adams, who was a supporter of the monarchy, and who would have liked to see the America of that time governed by a king, whereby he in fact also wanted to establish an American dictatorship. And so it happened that when the conflict with France broke out in 1798, he used the opportunity to enact one of the most controversial laws of U.S. America, namely the so-called Alien and Sedition Acts, which consists of 4 parts and which entitles the president to detain and deport every foreigner in the country. In addition, by attacking the first constitutional article, which guarantees the freedom of the press, he also determined that the publication of false and malicious writings against the president could be considered a punishable offense and prosecuted. This led to countless people being accused and sentenced on the basis of this law during John Adams' term in office. The only reason he was unable to realize his plans for the establishment of a dictatorship was the fact that he was not re-elected. President Thomas Jefferson, his successor, then immediately repealed and suspended 3 of the 4 parts of the law. The Alien Enemies Act, however, which allows that human beings who originate from states that were or are at war, etc., with the U.S. America can be deported, still exists even in the present time. Apart from the U.S. presidents mentioned up to now, who have caused great evil, there would be various others to be mentioned, which however would go much too far. Hence, I will only mention 2 more, so one being Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. Lincoln proclaimed on the 22nd of August, 1862, that his highest goal was the preservation of the Union. That is, the union of the American federal states, because in this union between the traditional South and the modern North, a deep rift had arisen, and so the whole thing had already been crumbling away for years. He further declared that if he could save the Union without having to free a single slave, then he would do it. This remark was precisely the opposite of why he was elected president, because he actually proclaimed the abolition of slavery in the USA. Contrary to this, however, he promised already during the election campaign in the year 1860 that he did not want to abolish the slavery, whereby the slavery should not be allowed anymore in the newly emerging federal states. Consequently, the Southern states rejected Lincoln as president. Thus, presidential contradiction and once again contradiction, resulting in 7 federal states leaving the Union and founding the Confederacy, which was the prelude to the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. The South fought for its traditional social system, while no reason for war was at hand for the North to wage war against the South. Consequently, Abraham Lincoln thought of providing a reason for war. Therefore, on the 1st of January 1863, he proclaimed the so-called Emancipation Declaration, according to which all slaves would be free with immediate effect. But this was nothing more than an evil trick to start a fight for the abolition of slavery from a political war. Therethrough a double weakening of the Southern Confederacy was brought about, because immediately more than 3 million Southern slaves became allies of the North, whereby many of them joined the fight against the Southern states, whereby of course many also met their death. And now, when finally the talk is of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, it has to be said that he too is not blameless. When the USA won the Spanish-American War in 1898 and rose to become a world power, the former British colony now became a colonial power itself, whereby Guam, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico were transferred from Spain to the USA. But since resistance against the new colonial power USA arose in the Philippines, the people defended themselves. When Theodore Roosevelt was then elected president in the USA in September 1901, it happened. When he had been in office for not even 2 weeks, that more than 50 U.S. soldiers were killed in a guerrilla attack on the Philippine island of Samar. Full of revenge and pathological craving for retaliation, Roosevelt commanded General Jacob H. Smith to solve the problem of the guerrilla war in the Philippines once and for all, so that no prisoners would be taken, but that instead everyone was to be killed and burned, and in fact, the more the better. This criminal command led to the so-called Philippine Balangiga Massacre, in which about 50,000 human beings were tortured, killed, and massacred. However, these were not guerrilla fighters first and foremost, but civilians, old human beings, women, and children. General Jacob H. Smith was well suited for this action because he was best known for his brutality, lack of human dignity, and as homicidal maniac, because already in the year 1890, he made a name for himself as a slaughterer and perpetrator of a massacre at the Wounded Knee Massacre, when masses of women, children, and men of the Miniconjou Lakota Sioux Indians were bestially slaughtered and massacred there by the U.S. soldiers. When the general was then put before a court-martial for this in 1902, he was acquitted at the insistence of the U.S. government, which meant that he was not held accountable for many thousands of murders. And now, once again, for the upcoming November, the majority of the population of the USA, especially the Republicans, will adore and build up such a major zero and first-rate psychopathy figure, so as to hype him up to become U.S. president. And if this Romney should take the helm, then the USA and the world can probably again expect something that will really take all the biscuits.
To that, it must be said that this man, Mitt Romney, is only standing up for his own interests because the concerns of the people and the country are anything but important to him. In the same vein, many of the former U.S. presidents did in fact act. As I have already once explained to you on a previous occasion, and also mentioned certain criminal and felonious acts of which they had made themselves guilty. And now, regarding the statements contained in this fax, I can only confirm them. With relation to the outcome of the election, It has to be said that unfortunately too many prejudiced by this man Romney financially mighty as well as simple-minded ones from the people will vote for him. But before this vote can take place in 2 months' time on the 6th of November, the election campaign will be overshadowed by an worldly, and as long as any human beings can remember, unseen hurricane, which will cause enormous damage on the east coast of the USA, the likes of which have never been the case in America before. Unfortunately, due to the storm, there will also be almost 60 human lives to mourn. However, this tremendous whirlwind will only be the beginning of further such and even more devastating whirlwinds, which in the future will cause much worse destruction worldwide than those caused by the coming whirlwind at the end of the month of October. And it is a fact in this regard that the humankind of Earth has to bear the blame for this, namely as a result of the overpopulation that has arisen and is spreading further and further, by means of which enormous and severe destructive effects will be caused on the whole of nature, its cycle, and thus also on the climate. I mention this predictively because this coming serious natural event will interrupt the election campaign activities for a short time, whereby, however, Romney will then, in an imperious and irresponsible manner, immediately after the storm, seize the opportunity to make propaganda for himself again, which corresponds exactly to his psychopathic, imperious, egoistic, and irresponsible nature, which should give his followers and voters something to think about. This while Obama will exercise his presidential duty and responsibility and take care of the human beings and the catastrophe. But the result of the election will then nevertheless be that the rational American men and women will once again vote for Barack Obama and thus prevent an election of the heavily psychopathic and also inconstant, as well as devious and dishonest Romney. If this man were to gain the might, then that whole large part of the American population, which does not belong to the really rich, would be very much to be pitied, because this part of the population would be tormented by Romney. The middle class would suffer very great disadvantages, and the class of the poor would fall into even deeper poverty, while various firms and corporations as well as the American state itself would be driven to ruin by this psychopathic, might-greedy, and human-hostile Romney. In foreign policy, too, a great deal of harm would be caused, and this economically as well as through criminal military and secret service actions, and everything would become even worse than it was the case under the two Bush who had might.
Aha. So then this evil can be avoided by the rational ones of the USA population. But with the USA, the whole thing cannot go on forever the way it was before Barack Obama came, who was to be thanked for the end of the Iraq engagement and the elimination of Osama bin Laden, but also for the huge humanitarian progress for the American people concerning the comprehensive health insurance, which this human-hostile Romney really wants to abolish again. When I consider what you confided to me as early as 1975 on my great journey, that the superpower USA could come to an end after 2020 according to your probability calculations, if nothing changes for the better in this state until then, and if allies with the USA continue to distance themselves from this state or even become open enemies, then Obama might perhaps be the crucial point that this can still be prevented, couldn't he?
That could be the case. But one must also consider what the Obama successors will then continue to do and what domestic and foreign policy they will pursue, because this will also determine what will happen after 2020.
Back in the year 1975, you mentioned on the one hand in particular the tremendous contradictions in terms of the politics, the economy, the military machinations, the decay of the culture, as well as the increasing phenomenon of religions and sects and the serious criminal acts or even felonies of the former presidents of the USA, and said that if one would continue to muddle through these things to the same and still increasing extent, then the collapse would be unavoidable. I have taken good notice of all that, and I can really understand if the result is as you have calculated. Furthermore, you also said at that time that China could then molt into the next world and superpower when the USA collapses, but that this would fundamentally require that China would rally strong allies around itself until then. Because these were necessary to have sufficient influence as superpower and to be able to exist as such at all. An economic power alone, such as China would be, which would be dependent on the world economy, you explained, would not be enough to be a superpower. But megalomania could lead to catastrophic attempts and worldwide acts of war in order to achieve a superpower position. But if now, in relation to the USA, one only considers the huge national mountain of debt of more than $16 million, which can no longer be repaid and for which the ongoing interest can only be paid barely or not even any longer amply, then even the least intelligent one must recognize how things stand with the USA. However, US America is indeed not alone in this. Because one only has to think of Germany, France, England, Spain, and Italy, etc., which are equally all around mismanaging and have mountains of debt weighing millions of millions. My home country, Switzerland, is also laid out to run up debt, even if only to the tune of more than 100,000 million, but that too is enough, and there is no one there to stop the bad actions. But to get back to the USA again, one also has to look at all the all-encompassing U.S. mismanagement and all the other inconsistencies as well as the zeros of U.S. presidents, whereby I, however, exclude Barack Obama, who among all the major zeros up to now drops out of the traditional role in a variety of things. Then I also see that your probability calculation could be fulfilled. Although there are certain things happening under Obama too that must not be seen as right. Whereby I am hereof thinking especially of the issue of the remote-controlled drones for the killing of terrorists and terror suspects. Yet you have explained in this connection that the whole of the corresponding body of thought and action does not originate with him, but with those who practically forced him to give his orders and signatures in accordance with their will and demand. You said that he himself would be practically mightless, even though might is officially attributed to him, and it would be held against him that he alone would be able to decide about the deadly drone missions, and in this respect would have taken the rudder directly to himself. Whereby he was, is, and will also be held responsible for the most diverse military and political machinations that did not, for example, do not, correspond to his ideas. Although he's a very mighty man, he is nevertheless dependent on his advisors as well as on all those who have the might to advise him disingenuously, to influence, to direct, and to force him according to their will. These mighty ones are the highest of the military, the Department of War and Defense, the Secret Services, but as well as also politicians, consultants, confidants, banks, the stock exchange and the groups of companies dealing with machines, pharmaceuticals and armaments and the government elites and religious sectarian leaders, etc. But if I now think about your probability calculations, then it makes me all the more assuming that your calculations can come true. When I consider that you explained at that time that the USA is inflicting more and more and increasingly tremendous damage upon its allies around the world, and that as a result resistance and even hostility against US America arises. Then I still want to explain, in relation to many predictions that you have made, that many have struck me very often hard, especially because I had to keep silent and was not allowed to give any warnings. Actually, I am quite happy today that you no longer make predictions, because these were always immensely burdening for me, because there was nothing I could do to prevent the events from becoming reality. Although you have allowed me to make an attempt to contact the US government via L, who was working for the CIA, however, the US government via the CIA then made unfulfillable demands, which were unfulfillable according to your will, which is why no positive relationship came about. I then actually received the unfulfillable demands in writing. But this too was indeed predicted by you. Consequently, after the fruitless attempt at contact with the US government, I did no longer make any further efforts in this matter, and would also not undertake such efforts again. Moreover, you also said yourselves that the attempt that was carried out would be the first and the last, and that you would therefore not allow anything further hereof. Therefore I will abide by that. But regarding predictions, if I am particularly interested in something of the future, will you same as up to now tell me further facts, as long as I do not publish them? And what will happen if the USA collapses?
We will continue to give you information if you want us to, or if you think it might be necessary to make a prediction available to the public, whereby it must then be a question on your part, and only about something very specific that no longer falls within the old scope of the predictions. And what you mention in relation to what I said regarding the U.S. President Barack Obama corresponds to the facts. Serious things are being blamed on him, which are not according to his own decision, but which he simply has to approve perforce. And much of what he wants in terms of positive changes, or what he has achieved for the direct welfare benefit of poorer parts of the population, is being maliciously negatively attributed to him by envious. Might greedy and rich ones and evil means are being used to try to abolish again the good that he has achieved. However, regarding what would ensue should the USA fall into ruin, this would mean that under certain circumstances, a dictatorship and naked Gewalt would arise, something which has already been emerging for years. The people of the USA are being put on an ever shorter leash, financially exploited, and deprived of everything from which they could benefit, something for which the rich and their hangers-on are mainly responsible, as well as those elite in government who only represent their excessive wealth, their greed for money, and their absolutely personal interests. But this corresponds exactly to the opposite of Barack Obama's ideas, who wants both good and the best for the people, but also for the state itself. And this political and government elite consists of both Republicans, but at the same time also of Democrats. Valuable reforms for the well-being of the population and the state are not in demand. Thus, the already deep-rooted poverty among the people continues to spread, while the rich enrich themselves more and more, whereby the social inequality is ever faster gaining ground. Thus, in the event of a collapse of the USA, only two possibilities can be considered, whereby the one boils down to a dictatorship with evil reprisals and great Gewalt, while the other possibility can be a new rebuilding. If people with a fundamental sense of responsibility reach the government and really do everything possible to bring about an effective and valuable new beginning. However, whether this will happen is currently highly questionable, because at present everything is in a totalitarian way directed towards economic, military, political and cultural, as well as strictly fundamentalist religious sectarian interests, and towards monstrous lies and disingenuous, human contemptuous, criminal, and felonious machinations in every conceivable regard. This also means that the population of the USA is spied on by the secret services and even in a purely neighborly manner, etc., and that their freedom is restricted in every possible way, and this in addition to the Gewalt, as it shows up openly and covertly in various forms. Also regarding China, I must stick to the statements I have made, just like the fact that the USA are a superpower, which spread death, ruin and destruction, as well as hatred and intrigue all over the world, where through the worldwide terrorism is steadily being further promoted. A terrorism which Obama is fighting according to the will of those who have forced him to do so and are now shifting the whole might and responsibility for it onto him alone. Among other things, with remote-controlled, death-bringing drones. And as far as the matter with the U.S. government, the CIA and with you is concerned, the following is to be said. The fact that the attempt to establish contact will fail was due to the imperiousness of the U.S. government and the contacted CIA people to about 92% predictable. However, an 8% possibility remained open that a small success might still occur. This was especially true because agents parked themselves in the restaurant Brückenwaage in Dusnang and kept contact with L in the center. For this reason, there was little hope, and so we assumed. I must confess that we ourselves also had certain expectations attached to this when we allowed you to try to establish contact with the government of the USA, because a small success might indeed have resulted. We therefore allowed you to make an attempt whereby, unfortunately, everything proved to be illusory. And it was really nothing more than an attempt. But we also did not want to simply pass over your insistence so that you could recognize for yourself that such an undertaking is very difficult. But the possibility, which was only 8% open, that something positive could have been achieved, was then nevertheless not crowned with success.
Aha. Then you have thereby, in a certain way, also given me a lesson, which, in this regard, was certainly good. Against your advice, however, I then tried to set up a FIGU group in the USA with interested American people, something which then, however, has also failed, namely 4 times to date. Unfortunately, it has turned out that most human beings in America do not understand what a democratic attitude actually is, and that a FIGU group can and may only persist and exist in a democratic way. All the time, the emphasis was placed on a ruling, directing and dictatorial action, but this was and is absolutely unacceptable, which is why we from the core group had to dissolve the corresponding US-American groupings again. Obviously, it does not seem to be understood that in a FIGU democracy, there must be no class differences, and that decisions must not be taken and executed by individual exercisers of might in a group, rather solely and only by the majority of the group members. With the democracy, there are no class differences at all, because it is solely and exclusively the mass of the majority that decides. In the FIGU core group, however, we have advanced another very big step ahead, because in our case, the level of democracy is so high that decisions are only valid if an absolute unanimity of all core group members is given. Apparently, however, in the USA, as sadly also in other states, it is not clear to the human beings what democracy actually means, and that only through it. A true community can really exist in peace, freedom, harmony, as well as in equality, equal rights, and equal value. Of course, there are many human beings in the USA, as well as in all other countries of Earth, who are interested in the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, that is to say, the spiritual teaching, and who would like to have a FIGU group in their own country. But this can effectively only be possible if such a group is handled and led in conformity with the FIGU democracy. I would also wish the same for the United States, even if you are not pleased with the ununderstanding on the part of the majority of the human beings of America with regard to their understanding of freedom, peace, harmony, and democracy. However, the human beings in the USA too are able to learn, and indeed it is a considerable number who are interested in the teaching and who also strive to respect the mission and the teaching. To life-based behave in conformity with the FIGU rules and the creational natural laws and recommendations, and to get an accordingly intended grouping on its feet. This, however, is unfortunately not easy, because many personal and also fellow human beings and governmental authorities' difficulties have to be overcome, whereby the personal problems are probably the greatest and most extensive. And this especially with regard to one's own correct behavior towards fellow human beings, and the acceptance of a comprehensively democratic attitude and leadership of a FIGU grouping.
Your opinion does you honor, but you have yours and we have ours, whereby ours has so far proved true. However, we would be happy to be surprised and taught, something that might become feasible. If the human beings in the USA, who are interested in the teaching and mission, will after all be able to free themselves from their wrong views, opinions, and behaviors, etc., and will be able to integrate themselves with the rules of FIGU.
A small number of persons are really trying hard to form a good FIGU grouping in the USA, so there are really good people over there who are trying very hard. If I thereby just think of Michael Horn, who has already worked so many years for the teaching and the mission, then he and his work cannot be valued highly enough. After all, not all human beings need to act to his indefatigable extent, because even a lesser effort is already very valuable, and such an effort can be accomplished by many in America. Admittedly, these are only a minority, but if these engage themselves, then much can be achieved through them. Even a small number of human beings can achieve much and bring about a change for the better and good in many others, if they make an effort. As the saying goes, constant dripping wears the stone. Looked at in this sense, everything that is loveless, evil, unpeaceful, disharmonious, false and unfree, as well as any Gewalt. When imperiousness and addiction to might, any hatred, any revenge, and any addiction to retribution can be worn away to the bottom, as can everything that is dictatorial and harming the body and the life.
There is nothing there with which to argue because your words correspond to the reality. But that does not change anything about our stance. Should something change for the better, for the good, and for the right with regard to the human beings and the behavior of the American persons, then we too will change our opinion. However, we are very pleased with the already for many years ongoing efforts of Michael Horn, whereby he has achieved unusual accomplishments, the value of which is impossible to estimate. Although we also acknowledge the efforts of all those persons in the USA who for decades strove for the formation of a FIGU group and also in terms of learning with regard to the spiritual teaching, they have nevertheless, unfortunately, not achieved what they claim to want to achieve.
Contact report 821.
Well, America, that is to say the USA, will not exist forever. Because as a state it is destroying and self-destructing from within, for which the process of dissolution of the state, although still continuing for a long time, began a long time ago. This process has been continued and kept alive, actually unconsciously, by the German descendant President Trump, so that the coming demise of America as a state will one day, in the still distant future, become reality. The USA will lose its hegemony, and thus the world power that is hoped for and aspired to in this regard, which is currently still America's endeavor, precisely to win world supremacy. However, the fact that the USA is already in the process of a creeping suicide, that is to say suicide, which has been evident for some time now through certain symptoms, is not yet recognized by anyone, because no one thinks about it, but simply lives into the day. The USA, that is to say its powerful, still think of themselves as a superpower, because many technical achievements convey a sense of security, which, however, has already begun to crumble in its foundations, which will one day bring its downfall. America underestimates the ruthlessness of its hegemonic behavior, and it also underestimates its democratic future, because within itself there is a ruthless willingness to use violence and discontent in very many human beings of the American population. Already the ancient immigrants, mainly from Europe, created networks of hatred against the original population. The Indians and the Wild West also took its inglorious role in killing many human beings. This, as wars also raged in America, and slavery was big in trade, when in Africa, etc., the human beings of a different color were robbed and chained, shipped and brought to America, if they survived at all. For example, when a storm broke out on the high seas and the chained slaves were simply thrown overboard because the ship had to be lightened in the storm and swell. The human beings who were robbed and chained were pulled alive by the heavy chains into the deep waters of the sea and thus left to die. Among the many Europeans who kept slaves in America and made great business and profits from the work of the shackled slaves were also Swiss, such as the builder of the Linth Canal and the Shetty confectionery manufacturer. America profited from the slaves who were flayed and murdered, with the murderer secret society Ku Klux Klan in particular playing the leading role as a murderous race hater, and to some extent still playing it today. And that America's first president was a murderer who shot a peace negotiator for no reason, who wore a white flag and could not even utter a word of his noble cause of negotiating peace, that was obligingly concealed and never made public. And indeed there would be more such incidents to say, but what has been said should be enough to understand that America is not what it claims to be. Well, the USA as a state will one day self-destruct and disband on its own and from within, because the USA state construct is only an illusory world that isolates itself from its own people and from the rest of the world through its internal security. America distrusts everything and everyone and denies anyone to sit at its own table who wants to bring true rights as well as goodness, humaneness, and humanly just laws into the country. America has since time immemorial had presidents and lackeys around them, as well as in all the world, who simply carry out commands and thoughtlessly commit murders and wage wars, interfere everywhere by means of secret services and cause calamity, and consciencelessly extinguish human lives. And this is done, approved and ordered by the American state leadership, whereby hardship and misery, as well as the greatest harm, is caused, and namely also by the religious sects that exist in America and are again and again newly created, of which sometimes fathers and sect members do neither shy away from sexual abuse of daughters or other child abuse, as concerning Catholic dignitaries, nor also from enrichment through murders. However, if someone dares to speak the truth about it, then they are threatened to their life, as it happened to me when I once said something against the practices of the America already believes that it is the ruler of the world, but this illusory empire will one day become a mirage that will shatter, because the USA will inevitably isolate itself from the rest of the world, even if this is not yet visible and recognizable to many human beings, but is already the still hidden beginning of its downfall. On top of all this, there is climate change, whereby America is unable to interpret the climatic warning signs and is also inexorably running to its doom in this respect over time. Not to mention the corona plague, which is also claiming many victims in America, as well as pompousness and criminality and actual crime and murder, etc., surpassing anything that can still be called normal. War is and remains America's profession for conquering the world, and just as it was looking for a reason to attack North Korea in 1964, it is now desperately looking for one, to intervene directly, and not secretly as it has done up to now, together with its NATO in the war in Ukraine. America also wants to dominate Ukraine and adapt it to the West, and is blaming all the evils in Ukraine on the Russians. Along with you, Bermuda, I have seen Ukrainian military form of firing into the air, running patrols and attacks that were truthfully just staged and made for news against the Russians. It was also interesting that in the war reports on TV, many buried bodies were found in a forest, allegedly massacred by the Russians. Yet Christian wooden crosses were placed on the graves throughout, which is really so unusual and strange that one has to wonder why the enemy still honors its victims on the graves with Christ crosses. What is clear is that the Americans want to dominate Ukraine and thus Russia one day, which is why everything was also done to make Putin lose patience and start the war, which has now lasted half a year and can go on for a long time due to the stupidity of the arms suppliers, which undoubtedly plays into the hands of America and the NATO murdering organization. America is deceiving not only its own people, but the whole world about the real USA intentions. All war crimes committed by the Ukrainian military are categorically and despite evidence denied, falsified and furthermore blamed on the Russians, also self-firing and self-bombing as we could observe ourselves together. But the truth is presented as fake by the Russophobes, and thus everything is distorted. America has more internal enemies than can be imagined, who are doing much to bring about the end of this state, even though it will be a long time before that happens. America will be hit with the full force of repressive G-Vault from within when the still clandestine opposition will one day abruptly reveal what it actually wants. Many tens of thousands will one day, as has already happened with Trump, not only take to the streets in protest, but take violent action to overthrow the government and put an end to the madness of U.S. hegemony and its own state.
This is another word from you that makes the truth so openly clear as only a thinking human being is capable of expressing it and, moreover, knows the future. However, I ask you whether it is good if you write down later in the discussion report what you said about the future, what it will bring for America. We should not give exact predictions, but what you said that...
Do not worry, because I did not say when the whole thing of the prediction will happen. So everything remains unclear and so speculative that it cannot be determined when the prediction will happen and be fulfilled. Human beings, however, who are truly capable of observation and clear thinking, already see the signs of what is coming at the present time, but they will be prevented from doing anything about it. As is usual on Earth, it will continue that those who really think and know, who are also able to honestly assess and recognize the truth, will be cut and not heard, but branded as conspirators and demonized in every conceivable form. So they will not be listened to, but will be shouted down and vilified.